Hello, everybody. Welcome to the As You Are podcast. My name is Leslie Vandergenst. I'm the founder of Enso Coaching and Consulting, and we're here with two of our amazing coaches, Libby and Kathleen, and we're joined by the amazing John Nehme, who is the CEO of Allies Against Slavery. Welcome, John. We're so happy to have you here.
Thanks, Leslie. It's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Well, we thought we would just start with a little bit of an overview for people who maybe don't know anything about Allies, what you guys do, and what your purpose and what your mission is.
Awesome. Allies is based in Austin, Texas, and we're dedicated to ending human trafficking. We have a vision that one day every community in the country will have all the data that they need to both identify and then ultimately prevent human trafficking from happening. I think a lot of folks don't realize that human trafficking is something that's happening not just somewhere else to someone else, but here in Austin and wherever they're located in their backyard, most likely. And historically, people haven't had the information that they've needed to really bring it to light, to bring it out of the darkness. It's a hidden crime for a number of reasons. And so our mission is to empower those who are on the front lines with the data and information they need to both see it better and then respond to it more effectively.
Oh, wow. That's amazing. So what kind of data do you guys provide to these people who are working on the front line? Let's just start there.
It really focuses on two or three different types of information. One is information about victims and survivors of trafficking. So how can we better identify those who are experiencing this, see them when it's happened, and then respond and intervene more effectively? And so information about vulnerabilities that somebody might have, what makes them vulnerable, and then how to better serve them and what the outcomes are related to those services that are delivered. So there's a whole category of information related to victim services, survivors, and outcomes. The second type of information or sort of bucket of information relates to those who are perpetrating this crime. So it's who is abusing others, who is trafficking others, what are some of the trends we're seeing around arrest data, prosecution data, how are we moving people through the justice system or not on this issue? What are businesses that are involved in this as well? Because trafficking is something that touches almost every sector of our economy. And so serving up information around perpetrators, but also where that intersects with businesses of interest. And then one of the aspirations that we have is to take all of that information along with publicly available sources of data, demographics, trends from census data, for instance, to look at, can we actually predict who might become vulnerable to this and then equip those communities to build resilience? So the whole point of this isn't just because we love data for data's sake, but to ultimately try to help people get in front of this and to stop it from happening. And we've seen models for that in other areas, sort of like social vulnerability indexes, right? How resilient is a community for a storm or for a pandemic? And so in a similar way, we want to be able to assess how resilient is a community for preventing trafficking, and then how can they build resilience on that?
Oh, wow. So when can you talk about, well, before we even get to that, when you talk about supporting people that are on the front line, how or what is the vision for how you guys support those frontline workers? Like, what does that look like, or what does that partnership look like?
You've articulated it well, because we're not directly involved on the frontline work where we're necessarily involved in intervening directly in a victim or survivor's life or delivering services. But so often those individuals, whether they're nurses or social workers or case managers or a counselor within a school district, they don't necessarily have the tools to see what's happened to the person that they're serving. They may serve, for instance, a youth who's been exposed to violence in a school district and they're a counselor. But one of the ways that we support them is by providing a screening tool that they can use to actually look for certain indicators that correlate to an experience of exploitation or trafficking. And it basically gives them the lens through which to look through to bring into focus the experience that that person who they're working with has had. And then assess, wow, I thought maybe they came in with one set of needs and actually they have another set of needs and I need to better respond to this other set of needs called human trafficking. And so they can then use that information that's coming from the screener to activate a certain set of services or a community response, or even call law enforcement if they need to. So that's one example. The other is really around decision makers who are working at a higher level or a systems level, and they might need statewide information and they want to actually start to connect some dots. So maybe they're responsible for statewide budget and spending on human trafficking. We're starting to see states send out millions of dollars to target this problem and then report back to the legislature on what's happened. They need the data to actually show our interventions were effective. We spent the money in the right places or not. So that's another set of customers, partners that we serve with that data, and they use that information to get a better sense of, is it working at the highest level?
Gotcha. Okay, so how, I know advocacy, we've had some conversations in the past, and I know advocacy is a huge part of your life and who you are. How did you get into this line of work, or how did Allies get started?
Yeah.
That's a clear path.
Totally. Yeah. If you had asked me when I was 12, I would have told you.
This is what I'm going to do.
Laid it out.
Yeah.
Plan by plan.
Just turned 38, have it all mapped out. No, it's interesting. I do think you look back and you start to see how puzzle pieces were fitting together. And two sort of streams or threads that I think have been woven together to really shape the answer to that question for me. I think the first is there's just this deep sense that I've always had. I think it's probably driven most fundamentally by a faith component for me, but it's ultimately this sense that my life's work was going to be about helping people who are on the margins. I didn't know the vehicle for that, whether that was in the business world or in public sector and government, or now it happens to be the social sector. But this sense that my unique, I probably wouldn't have used these words, but my unique gifting or skill set was going to be leveraged to help people who were on the margins or had been pushed to the side, and try to help move them back to the middle. I think, though, that what uniquely shaped me for this particular vocation was also an experience that my family had. My family has experienced sexual violence, not trafficking, but it hit close to home, this idea of somebody experiencing sexual violence in my family. And so I think for many years that experience was always that other family members, but then realizing more recently that that was actually something that had happened to me in just a different way, right? And so to have walked through that experience with family was really shaping me and what it looked like to be an ally, to be an ally with others who had experienced sexual violence. And so I think that those two sort of twin threads, right, of one, just a sense of calling and disposition to be committed to this kind of work, and then another where there was this family experience that hit close to home. Those two came together, and I feel a ton of gratitude actually to be doing something that feels so central and personal to my calling, my vocation.
Yeah, absolutely. Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say thank you for sharing that and being so vulnerable and open.
Yeah. When I lost my train of thought now because it was good. It was good. It was so good, Kathleen. Well, when you think about wanting to get into this advocacy work and like wanting to support people that are on the margins, I think, a lot of people go to the natural place, which is like get in on the front lines, work with organizations like Red Oak who happen to be guests with us a couple of last season. But the choice that you guys made, or that you kind of went into, was this work around data. And so what kind of shaped that path, versus a central, like, John's going to go help the people who are being, who are vulnerable directly?
I'll back up and then get to that, because I think what is interesting is you learn about this issue and there's this sort of visceral reaction because it is so deeply human, right? There's something so fundamental that we all, I think, can connect to about.
Yes,
right?
Exactly, right? Like this, we all get, no matter where you are on the political spectrum or what, like whatever category you're in, people agree we shouldn't have slavery. We shouldn't have human trafficking. And I think those that don't agree typically are perpetuating the problem, right? But for the most part, we all agree on this, and there's something that's so fundamental about what it means to be human that this issue touches on. So I think when you learn about it for the first time, there's this huge emotional response. There was, for me at least. I first learned about it watching a documentary film, and I was a senior in college, saw this film, found out that people are still enslaved today, thought, how in the world, thought we had taken care of this. And I thought I was a pretty aware person, and still learning about this for the first time, realizing, oh my gosh, there's so much I don't know. But the solution that was presented to me at the time was walk out the door, go to the airport, fly to Southeast Asia and start kicking down the door of brothels, like rescuing
Yeah.
people, right?
Yeah.
Right.
That very hands-on, and that just, it wasn't realistic for me. And I think there are certain professional giftings, like where you go into that work. If you're a counselor, if you're in law enforcement, if you're going to be an investigator, you're a lawyer, perhaps, right? A prosecutor. But if you're not one of those, then how can you be involved in this? And so I think I honestly pushed this issue out of sight and out of mind for a little while until came back across it because my sister had launched a documentary film looking at sex trafficking in Austin. And I came onto that project with her, and she had filmed the very first meeting of Allies Against Slavery with 25 volunteers meeting in a public library. So I came onto this film project to tell this story, but kind of had a foot in both worlds as a volunteer and as someone who was going to document what was happening in our city. But I do think that as it became clear that Allies was going to become my full-time gig, I was our first paid staff person when we formed a 501c3 in 2014. I wasn't going to be a counselor doing hands-on work with victims and survivors, especially when the majority of those are female. And I'm not a detective, I'm not a lawyer, but the opportunities to be involved are so much bigger than I think we ever imagined. And so when you start to look at why does this issue happen? What is it driven by? Who does it impact? You realize that our very sort of like essence as neighbors, as consumers, as advocates, there's so many creative ways to be involved. And so I think the lens through which I understood of like, how can I be in this space was really expanded. And then the data story in particular, it's unique. I think when Allies was formed, we were constantly driven by this question, are we getting any closer to actually solving this problem? And I think that's just maybe how I'm wired a bit, like wanting to sort of relentlessly ask that question. And I couldn't answer it for anybody with any kind of integrity. And so that set us on this journey of figuring out, okay, how do we measure this thing so that we can try to understand if we're getting any closer to solving it? And if we're not, then do something about that. And so we partnered with the University of Texas. This was 2014 to 2016, late 2016, and produced the first statewide study of human trafficking, first statewide prevalence estimate, and found that at any given day, a lot of people were being exploited in our state, but very few were being identified. And it was kind of that moment of like, oh, we've spent 2 years studying this. The problem's bigger than we thought. We're not that close to solving it yet. And along the way, getting data to actually demonstrate if we were was really hard and messy. I think we have to double down there. And so Allies, we had been focused on a number of different things, quite frankly, a very broad, generic vision. You can get into this, and we're kind of on the precipice of failure, quite frankly. We had come to a place where we needed to make some strategic decisions. We're going to focus in and really have impact in this area, or we're going to keep kind of limping along in this broad vision. And so we decided, you know what, I think we can have the greatest impact if we focus on this data piece and on this victim identification piece, like helping use data to illuminate the problem in a way that people can identify victims and help them connect to care.
Wow.
That.
I mean, I just want to highlight just a couple of things, right?
I'm like,
Well, there are some really critical key things here, right? So number one is that question that you are asking of like, are we getting closer to solving the problem? Which I think a lot of times businesses in general, let alone like a nonprofit, is asking the question of, are we getting closer to solving the problem, right? So that's number one. That's takes a lot of focus and can be challenging. But then the second thing is, we want to solve all of these problems, or we have all this potential opportunity. How do we get narrower so that we're putting our energy and our efforts in the right things that are going to potentially move the needle forward? And going from broad to narrow is also a really challenging thing for businesses. So the fact that that you guys are doing this as a 501c3, you're asking these huge vision questions and also willing to kind of put some things aside so that you can stay focused is just that's a huge accomplishment, a huge pat on the back. Yeah.
Thanks. I will say that failing is a great forcing function.
Yeah.
I mean, I was confronted with my own limitations in leadership. Allies was facing some strategic decisions because of failures that I had had as leader, and also just market conditions, we can call it that. Like we hadn't raised the money that we needed to raise. And so we had made some bets and they didn't play out. And getting to the end of 2016, early 2017, one of the hardest moments for me was actually starting 2017. It was our first team meeting of the year. I still remember it, January 3rd. We were a very, very small team, but gathering the team together and basically having to say, we have 4 weeks of cash in the bank. Sorry.
Yeah.
And have an emergency meeting with the board and basically dive into like, emergency and crisis response 101 and learn that on the job because I had never experienced anything like that. And so it was that experience, because I don't want to take kudos for like we just had this sort of enlightened understanding that we need to focus and be, it was really like, it was painful, and realized if we're going to survive, then we need to focus the mission. We need to rebuild the team. We have to have a strong sense that I am supposed to stay in this work, like a personal calling, and then rebuild the board and have cash in the bank. So there were sort of like 4 or 5 must-haves that basically were commitments that I made to the board and to my wife that year, and was like, we have until December 31st to figure this out. Or I'm going to go do something else. And so that year, we can get into that if you want to, but there was just, I think, proof point after proof point that the shift we were making was the right one. And we ended up finishing the year with that focus that you talked about, sort of a renewed, the mission was still the same, but the sort of nuance within the mission was different. We were rebuilding the team. We had some donors step up and had $250K in the bank, and then we were adding new board members. And so it was sort of like check, 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 check. So we started 2018 in a very different place than we started 2017. But we're on a pretty tough journey that year to do some soul searching.
I love that. I mean, we like to get into the dirty, so
we do. We like to talk about all the failures, all of the things that.
Well, and to your point, right? I mean, we, like I think a lot of the language we try to use is that these are all like learnings. These are all like learning opportunities for us. It's never truly a failure unless we, just buckle up and give up, right? And so when you talked about a couple of areas of quote unquote failure, opportunity, from a leadership standpoint, that was the first thing that you mentioned. What were some of the things that you felt were great opportunities for you to learn in that capacity?
I had led in a very transactional way. And I think probably the best way to articulate it is I thought I had all the answers. I was pretty convinced of my point of view. Enneagram 1, so like things done right and well, and there's a certain way to load the dishwasher, there's a certain way to write a report, there's, like fill in the blank. And so I think and because I do kind of live in vision world, which I think is okay, I didn't have a strong sense of how to operationalize that well. And I think we were lacking that as an organization in that season as well. So I think you had like transactional leadership, big vision that was more pipe dream because it wasn't connected to actual like strategy that could be implemented. And then probably a more critical environment in which there was a lot of like, hey, this needs to be done this way at this standard, but not a lot of support for that. So those were some of just a few, like to get into the dirty, you said, and like look at the dirty laundry. Those were a few of the things that were limitations of mine as a leader. And I think I was also optimistic to a fault in the sense that I wasn't willing to face the truth that things weren't going well. And so I wouldn't say I actively hid, but I actively ignored warning signs that should have been responded to earlier, should have brought the board in earlier, should have been honest with the team earlier, and kept kind of thinking, no, one of these big things that I'm like swinging for the fences, right? It'll come through. It'll come through. And it didn't. And so then I was kind of forced to face reality. So those are a few of.
Well, and what was the transition for you kind of from this like transactional place, or from this, like it should be done a certain way, or, how did you pivot, and what does that look like from an accountability standpoint for yourself?
I think one of the most important things that happened that year in particular was realizing that I was not allies and allies was not me. And it was just like my identity had been so wrapped up.
Good.
And I think a lot of people
John.
that go into social impact work,
I was going to say
it's not just social impact, but it's
right.
You're trying to work out something in yourself too. Am I good enough? Can I do enough to like fill in the blank? But I think when allies started to fail and I was allies, that meant I was starting to fail. Mm-hmm. And then when I was starting to fail, that meant that like I had to kind of go back to ground zero, right? And that year was a year of deconstruction, not just of the organization, but of myself as a person. Checked into spiritual direction, checked into counseling, kind of had all the things going on at the same time. And so I think it was sort of understanding like, what are the things that are driving me that I need more self-awareness around to be able to do this in a healthy way. And so some of it was just decoupling the business or the organization from me personally. And when I was able to do that, I could also be more open-handed with what was happening inside the organization. It didn't have to be this thing that looked just like me or operated just like me. That could be really good, more expansive.
Yeah. Well, what were some of the things you learned about yourself in that process?
Well, I think a couple of the things that I learned that were probably things that I'm still carrying with me today. A conversation that's actually timely for us right now at Allies is around pace. It's like how fast we're moving, and then the connection between the vision and then how quickly we expect to get there. And so one thing I learned about myself is that when I start to move really, really fast, and I'm a fairly high capacity leader, and I think when I start to move really, really fast, what I can shift into is more of that transactional mode, like I mentioned earlier, which usually looks like less patience for people around me. Not higher expectations, but like more, I can operate more punitively around that, like be harsher around that. And so I think I just kind of diagnosing that cycle, like when I speed up, I can like shift into this mode of operating and being with people around me, and I don't want to do that. Yeah. And so understanding how to like cycle back from that was one of the big lessons that year. Yeah. I think another thing was, and this is something, if the team listens to this, they'll get a kick out of it, because we talk about the difference between something that's different and something that's wrong. That's been a big thing that we've talked a lot about.
Hard thing.
And honestly, having hard conversations is something I had to grow in, figure out how to have good, healthy conflict. Yeah. And before, I wasn't really open to that. Like, conflict sort of scared me. So I think I sort of overcompensated, like avoiding conflict by just sort of setting a direction and not even like letting there be conflict, because it was just usually my direction or what I thought was best. And now I think I'm more comfortable with a healthier level of conflict that actually, it's like, let's put the idea on the table. Let's all go after it. And then let's move on, like once we decide. And so there's sort of an open-handedness that goes along with that as well.
That's really good.
How do you feel like kind of in this transition that you've made, how has that impacted the way that you build your team? So as you're looking at, bringing more people onto Allies, and I know Allies is growing, how has that impacted the way that you bring others on and decide who gets to join in the journey?
Yeah, that's a great question. We like to say two things when we're hiring. When people ask us about the culture of Allies, we talk about high personal care and high professional care. And maybe seems like a paradox, but it's one of those things that we're trying to hold together. We care about people on a personal level deeply and what's going on in their lives, and we care about what's going on professionally and hold a high standard. And I think attracting people that live that out in the organization is a big part of what we're about, where they can come and care well for their teammates and also care really deeply about the mission and the work that they do and doing excellent work. So that's one area. I think the other thing is trying to really lead with the values rather than lead with the skill sets or demands of the job. I mean, that's clearly important. But once you get to the final stages of hiring, you're usually looking at people that are like more or less equally, maybe not equally skilled, but like more or less bring the core competencies of the job to the table.
Mm-hmm.
And then it's more of a filtering exercise around, at least for us, around how are they going to show up as a teammate and how are they going to show up from a value standpoint.
Yeah.
And not so much culture fit in that we're trying to fit everybody into our box, but just more, can they come in and actually enrich and extend the culture leading through the values that we've outlined. So some of that is me not just looking at merit on the resume. That's a starting place. And then to really vet around the values piece. Because I think we've all heard this analogy. It's like having that like high performer on a sports team, but they suck as a teammate.
Yeah.
It's like, okay, maybe they score 30 points a game, but they're just like
Awful to work with.
selfish.
You don't want to be around them.
And so it's not so much that you would take less skill in other teammates, but in some ways you almost would, right? You kind of like, you want the team to be what's excellent and the unit to work really well as a team, because that's what's going to win long term, more than just like the one star player.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, I love that.
My board chair, Kyle, says it's better to have an A team with a B idea than a B team with an A idea.
Oh, I like that.
So it's
I
like,
like that too.
It's good.
Yeah.
You gonna say something?
No, I mean, I was going to say like a million things and then we move on from them. So I'm just staying alive and present. And of course, that notion of like, I'm a firm believer in upskilling and transferable skills. And so all the more that like the right people
Teach the skill, but
Absolutely.
the core of it.
Yeah. And I think too, one of the things I was really curious about with you as you were talking about how much you've learned and grown when thinking about like what would take you personally kind of to that next place you want to be as a leader.
I think I'm more aware than ever of what I don't know about the next stage of growth within the organization. And what I mean by that is we're coming into a level of complexity and size and scale that I've never led through before. And so I'll raise my hand on that. Like when you are a part of starting something and then you grow up with it, you're always entering into that phase of learning kind of on the job. And I've never really had to apply for a job like in a classic sense. And so like I recognize that's a luxury that most people don't have. But I think what that means for me too is that as I get into these next stages of where we want to be and think about, well, what does that team look like in 3 years? If we're doubling in size and the budget's doubling, I don't know how to lead that organization today. And just being honest about that. And so as I come into coaching conversations, it's really doing the work of sort of figuring out, okay, if we want to be here, but we're here today, getting role clarity for everybody, including myself, is, I feel like, one of the big parts of the job right now.
Oh, yeah.
Because there's been so much change in the organization as well the last 6 months. I don't have a job description right now.
Oh, wow.
So it's like, I've got to rep, and so I need that too. What am I focused on? So when you've asked the question about growth areas, I think it's around learning what I need to be focused on right now, both for the organization and for myself to grow in the ways that I need to alongside allies. And some of that I have a sense of, but some of it I don't yet.
I love the notion of, you talked about, and this is kind of bringing it back, but it stuck out to me, just this want to help and like to make things better, but it can seem like such a daunting, like, I need to go and like kick down doors. That's what I got to do. I have to be on the front lines. And I think this kind of goes back to also a common theme that we've had with a lot of our guests is that you knew you wanted to help and that this is where your heart was, but it didn't make sense for you to do it in the traditional way. So you made a way. And I think that is very much a common thing of someone didn't see what they wanted and it didn't exist the way that made sense for them. So they paved their own path. And I think that that's so, I think it's just so cool. And it's a cool way to think about it can be very overwhelming sometimes thinking of there's something you're passionate about or you want to do, and it might not be the conventional answer of how you go about helping. And your skills might, it might be more fit for data and coming up with all of these, right, than actually being the person that is on the front lines. And I just think that speaks volumes for you, but then it's just has been very much a common theme for
It's a good lesson.
guests,
for everybody, right?
Yeah.
How encouraging it can be that there are gaps everywhere.
Yes.
And that, it's looking at them in a certain way. And I think like a big theme that's come out is being able to go from something so big to something so focused.
Yeah.
And that's where you'll discover what is your niche, what is what you have to offer.
Yeah. Can you talk a little bit about that? So when you said 2017, 2018, you guys really did kind of have to get to the narrow space. So how did you guys decide where to get narrow? And then how did you and you said we started to see that this was the right path.
Yeah.
And what evidence did you have around that?
So I love systems change stuff and probably spend too much time thinking like big picture about that. And so much so that it's actually really healthy and helpful for me to remember that ultimately we're also just about helping one person and sort of like holding that tension between this big picture, all encompassing change. I find myself trying to often like find an organizing theory for like, if we do this way, then like all of it's fixed, which is pretty.
Just be so nice though.
I know, wouldn't it? I know. So I think as I've grown, realizing that that's actually less realistic than I thought it was in my 20s is wise. There's wisdom in that. But I think the journey of what we went from broad to narrow and how we did that, which is actually unlocking an opportunity to be like to think more expansively again. And I'll get to that. But it's, we had this sense early on that because human trafficking is such a complex problem, it's not the kind of problem that you can solve in a linear fashion, right? We're like building an airplane. It's complicated. It's not complex, right? It's hard to do, but if you follow the right steps in the right order with the right team, you'll build an airplane.
Right.
Trafficking is something that's so interwoven and interconnected to so many root cause issues that if you just say, well, we're going to fix like addiction, right? Like we know that fentanyl and trafficking, there's this intersection now. We know that often a vulnerability for exploitation is addiction, or that traffickers actually use drugs to coerce victims. We'll just take this example and run with it, right? If we could just solve the fentanyl crisis and addiction issues, then we solve trafficking. Well, that's actually not a true statement, right? You have to solve poverty. You have to solve systemic racism. You have to solve the foster care system, like, and all of a sudden it is just like this overwhelming, oh my gosh, right? And we're still just talking about like one type of trafficking in the United States. We're not necessarily talking about it on a global scale yet. But so early on, thinking holistically like that and comprehensively led us down a path of this vision of building what we were calling slave-free cities. So could you imagine if Austin was the kind of place where slavery couldn't exist? What would it take for that to happen? How would we do that? And we had this very like beautiful systems diagram of like how to accomplish that. And it was a pipe dream. But it had all these moving pieces associated with it. And I think the clarifying factor other than failure that year was also, okay, maybe we're thinking about this the wrong way, in the sense that instead of trying to do everything at once at the same time, is there a leverage point inside this broader system that we can really focus on that has this cascading effect? I don't know if this has been debunked or not, but you guys have heard about like wolves being reintroduced to Yellowstone and how that changed like the whole ecology of like, and some people have come out on Snopes and been like, that's not exactly how it works. So I don't know, but I like the idea
for what it's worth.
I like the idea. And it's like wolves basically have become extinct in Yellowstone. That had like a downstream effect because they were an apex predator. And then they got reintroduced, and because they started, like, I'm not going to get the food chain perfectly so listeners don't, but they started eating certain animals, right? Who then like weren't eating other animals. And then all of a sudden, like there was this cascading effect across the ecosystem. So in theory, the idea was, well, maybe there's actually a way to focus on one change that has this dynamic effect on everything else. So I think the backdrop of 2017 was trying to figure out what that focal point could be. And I think in our theory at the time, at least, you have a lot of people being exploited. You have few being identified, but we're spending a lot of time and energy and money, rightfully so, on building all these services. And we're not even moving people out of the burning building. So it's a little bit like the, you're pulling bodies out of the river, but then you have to like go upstream and understand why they're falling into the river. We've all heard that story. So it was a little bit of that. Like, could we figure out what it is that we need to do to just really like blow the doors off this victim identification piece of this puzzle? If you think about this continuum or this system, people being exploited, people being cared for, we've got this broken feedback loop here with people being identified. So some of it was like just kind of a narrowing of our theory of change. And we thought, okay, if we could help everybody identify victims, then we're moving people out of this burning house. And even if we create a backlog for available services, then we're actually generating some demand for increasing those services. So that was a little bit of this like big picture to narrow picture. But I think what is exciting now is that we've had 5 or 6 years of focusing on that narrow picture and gone from almost no screenings in the state of Texas of vulnerable children and youth to now over 150,000 screenings across the state of Texas. It doesn't equate, like not every screening is a victim or confirmed case, but we're basically casting a very wide net now, safety net, to try to intervene in the lives of people who might be vulnerable. And of those, about 10% are coming back with the highest concern on their screenings, which is most correlated to an experience of exploitation or trafficking. So it's just this example of like you start small, focus there. And what that's done is then create this huge safety net that's allowed us to really focus on some of these other responses now too.
Well, and I'm assuming because this is the data world, right, that we're living in, is the more information that you get, the more focused and more narrow and more clear you guys can get around where exploitation is happening or where people are vulnerable, right? So even if it's not yielding a high percent or a high vulnerability rate, you're still capturing data that's going to inform the future.
Right. Yeah. And when you think about on a population scale, realistically, we wouldn't see like 50% of the population being trafficked, right? See a much smaller percentage. So that 10% of this vulnerable population is actually, it's in line with what folks are seeing in other places, and it's still a significant number. But there's this virtual cycle with data where if you're collecting the right kinds of information, the more of it you have, the better it gets, the better your insights can be, the more you can do with it. And because we can now connect it to other kinds of data, we can start thinking expansively again about, okay, what does this look like in other areas? Like, because we know more about who it's happening to, where, and why, we can actually be more expansive in our solutioning process rather than having to exclusively be narrow. So we're still doing mostly just that data work, but then we can build partnerships with others who can take on different pieces of that solution ecosystem.
Yeah, that's really smart. Now, how are you allowed to talk about like where you guys are located or like where you guys are forming these partnerships statewide? Because I know you're in Texas. So. We're
in Texas. Yep. We work with the governor's office here in Texas and about 130 or so agencies across the state. Also working in Louisiana. They have an Office of Human Trafficking Prevention at their governor's office. And then we're working with, it's probably between 20 to 40 organizations on the ground in Louisiana. And then most recently, we partnered with the University of South Florida in St. Petersburg, who is legislatively mandated to establish a statewide human trafficking data repository. And we're contracting with them essentially to provide our solution so that they can use it to accomplish that goal.
Great.
And the crazy idea is to try to do this with every state in the country. And I think the fun problem is that we can't do that one state a year. Well, we can't do it yet. 12 people. What,
come on. What do you like?
Now you know why we're so tired. But we couldn't do it one state a year for the next 47 years, or we'd all be dead. So I think we're in this fun moment. Fun might not be the right word. It feels fun to me, but it's we're like, okay, how do we grow in a way that we don't kill ourselves trying to do this? And then how do we do it in more places at the same time without trying to do it the same way we've done it? Because that won't scale. And then who do we need in order to accomplish that, because the jobs we were doing 2-3 years ago are not the jobs to be done in the next 2 or 3 years.
Yeah.
So it's just like this huge moment of flux and change, but tons of opportunity in that. And the team is so committed and dedicated to kind of rolling up their sleeves and figuring out how to get there together.
Yeah, that's awesome.
What has been, so we like to talk about curiosity. What has been your biggest unlock for curiosity as you're growing?
Clarify a little bit for me, like on a personal level, organizational level. Or...
whichever direction you want to go, I love a both to that. But I think some of what brought on the question for me was thinking about all the creative entry points into doing this kind of work. And as you're growing, how much creativity there will need to be. And, when you were speaking a bit about like what all you learned as a leader was being, more open to there's so many ways to doing things. So like, what is I don't know. I lost where I was going with that initial question, but thinking about like keeping curiosity front of mind, and what do you hope to unlock? Where do you feel maybe the like biggest gaps that need to be filled because of curiosity? Does that get?
Yeah, it's great. You guys actually helped us unlock curiosity as one of our leadership attributes. And so we've been...
In so coaching and consulting, unlocking things. Thank you.
We had a set of organizational values, but then defining what are some of our expectations around how we show up as leaders in the organization. And so that word has been big for us. And it's been fun to see how many times we can slip it in, almost like Mad Lib style to like any conversation.
Yeah. I did hear you say excellence a few times, so I am hyper aware of that word because it's
just taking a tally.
It's good.
It took a lot of humility for me to remember that. That was another one. Humility. I could give you all 5 of them. So curiosity. I think a couple things. There's a curiosity still around if our core theory of change is right. I think we're past the proof of concept stage because we're now in a 3rd state. More states are knocking. There's clearly an appetite in the market for the solution that we're providing. We're still aligning, like figuring out the business model on that some. But there's a curiosity on like who in 5 years, who's really using the services and the technology and the data that we're providing, and what are they doing with it specifically? And so we're in kind of another round of updating the theory of change in our impact model just to get really clear on what are the expectations and assumptions we have around that impact, and then how do we measure that, especially for an organization like ours that's measuring indirect impact a lot of times. We've got things that we're in control of, but then so much of what actually changes in the lives of people in this work is not exclusively up to us. They're going to take the information we have and then they're going to go do something in the world with it. And what they do and the impact it makes, like how do we back up and measure that? So I have a curiosity around all of that right now because we have assumptions and just excited to kind of see if it plays out. And realizing that we're not going to learn that just behind the computer, but we got to get out and like talk to more of our partners and customers and actually hear from them on that. So that's one area. I do think another one is around team and the growth of the team. And I think the curiosity for me there is twofold. One, it's what do we need that we don't have today? Both like as current team members, but also like for new team members. So what roles do we need to be thinking about? And even maybe before it's a role, like what functions, because I think it's helpful sometimes to just start at that level before you start to try to put like a role or a title on it or even someone's name on it. Like we're kind of just backing up from what's the shape of the activities this organization has to go do, and how can we create role clarity within that? So that's a curiosity for me. I think another curiosity is how much is this going to take from me? And what I mean by that is an area of self-awareness that I have is, this is going to sound so silly at some level, but we have this huge vision, and is achieving that vision in the time frame that we've set out realistic, given the structures and resources that we have today?
Mm-hmm.
And if so, if not, what has to change?
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
And what's going to change for me as well?
Mm-hmm.
We've kind of gotten into like I would say before the last 6 months, we were in like a very comfortable pattern in terms of like, we know how to serve a state. We know what it takes to do that.
Mm-hmm.
I know what it looks like to wake up and go into the office and lead allies. And we're sort of entering uncharted territory where there's more ambiguity. And so I'm excited to learn what's in store there. And then on the personal front, I've got a 10-year-old and 3 others behind that. I was thinking a little bit about this idea of work-life balance, and there's not a balance right now for me. Like there's just, it feels like I surge with like what is needed most. So like there's time during the day at work, and then there's time at home. And I wouldn't even say like, if you're looking at scales, those are always equally weighted in terms of just sheer volume of time. But the needs of my family are growing as well. So I think to be like a fully integrated person that realizes that work's taking off and family is taking off. And so how to do both of those things well.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Have you considered not sleeping? I just
Yeah.
would
Overrated.
recommend it. Yeah.
Who needs that?
Yeah. I
do.
will say that that time in the morning before anyone else is up is really
Oh,
wonderful
it's so
time.
good. Yeah.
Yeah.
By the way, sorry, for anyone listening out there, from so many folks, especially folks with kids, that has been like a recurring. Before everybody gets up, this is
Do
your
it.
time.
Yeah.
You get
Even
the day
if you're
going.
grouchy about it, you're gonna like it as soon as you like it.
Yeah.
Make yourself
Yeah.
up.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, and you had mentioned earlier about like, you are not allies. Allies is not you. And we can stay with the family piece for longer, but I am also curious, like, hyphenated identities. John is father, husband. John is allies. Like, what other things would you put in your hyphens?
Marathon runner.
Good question, Kathleen. Yeah, half marathon. Spartan runner.
Hey, Spartan.
Yeah,
My God.
that was fun. I've done 2 of those.
Oof, nice.
Yeah, I think I would say husband, father are our primary vocations right now.
Good.
CEO
Mm-hmm.
and friend is a big one. There's a theme right now for me around friendship. I think especially men are struggling with friendship, and I don't think the recipe for how to be a good friend is that complicated, but it's hard. And some of it I think is just around the way that society and community is structured today. But showing up in people's lives is a big deal, and just being a good friend.
Yeah.
That was a theme for my father-in-law, who I lost 2 years ago. And his just sort of way of showing up in people's lives was a huge inspiration for me. So that's a big theme. Friendship. Those are probably the major themes. I think another piece that's related to that, though, is actually what I'm trying to say no to.
Yeah. Oh. We're all like, oh.
We're big no supporters,
Yes.
Yeah.
No.
We're big no supporters.
It's powerful.
Yep.
Just can't do it all right now.
Yeah.
But some of what's striking to me too in your list is it seems to a lot of it be relationship driven, your identity.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think when we get to the end of it all, there's not that much else we're going to be laying around and in our final breaths hoping for.
It's the 10 wishes of the dying, right? Is that right? 10? 5. 10.
No, that's a
I might
lot of
have
wishes.
10 wishes.
Yeah.
I know.
They're like, you're
Well,
only
it's-
allotted 5.
there's a book.
I've got 10.
Okay,
It's not just Leslie's
theory.
No.
But
I've
there's a
spoken to a
book. I
lot
think
of
it's the
dying
10
people.
wishes of the dying. I think it's the book, 10 Wishes of the Dying, and that's probably the number
It's
one
relationships
thing is your
and that.
relationships.
Yeah.
And,
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, John, I had probably like 17 more questions for you. So I don't know. We may need to do another one at some point just to kind of follow up on some of these.
I have a whole part 2 that I want you to do on man friendships. That is like a...
By the way, man friendships. I had questions about like, what is your system for kind of doing these there are these check back ins on like, are we heading in the right direction? Like, how do you systematize that? There's I have more questions. So
there might be a part 2.
I mean, like, I'm throwing out this thought with part 2 also, like, you know, a year from now, because there's so much growth that's happening. And how cool to do a like check-in.
Yeah, that would be good.
As you're at this major point.
Now.
We're calling
You're
it now.
okay with it.
Let's do it. Let's do it.
Yeah.
Wonderful.
Love it.
Well, we always like to wrap up with this is the question of what's next, what's next. And we kind of did hit on that, but is there anything specific that you would say about like next 6 months, next year, next couple of years, this is what's next for allies?
I think what's interesting is we feel clear about what we're calling our 2027 vision, mostly clear. What we're in the thick of trying to define right now is go to market on a few of those things. And so I think the devil will be in the details on that, which when you say what's next, like it feels like the second half of this year is going to be full of some significant milestones where we have made choices about how we want to show up in the world on some big deliverables that then will be charting the course for that 2027 vision. We're clear on the why, and I think we're clear on the what. It's the how that's going to be very fascinating for us. And I think it's just going to take some courage to make some calls along the way on that. There's things we're saying to say we're saying no to some things. I know we all kind of like exclaimed at that comment, but I've heard a great definition of strategy as basically the ability to discern what you're going to say no to ultimately at the end of the day, like thinking through all these things so that you can be focused to say like, this is the path we pick. So
we also call that maturity.
Yeah.
Right. That's a hard
yeah,
thing, but
I like that definition of it. Yeah. So that's one area of what's next. The other, on a more personal note, is that I feel like I get like 2 to 3 year horizons of vision for stuff in general. Like it's like, okay, I have a sense of like marching orders personally for the next 3 years. And I feel like 40 to 50. So I just turned 38, and I feel like 40 to 50 are going to be like significant years for me professionally and personally. And so this isn't a great answer with a lot of clarity other than to say like, I feel like there's a lot of kind of dirty work that's happening right now in order to prepare for that stage. And so I've been telling people it's kind of like that feeling you get maybe before like a big workout or something hard that you have to do. Where like, I know this is going to be good, but it's not going to feel good right now because it's going to require a lot of change and reordering. But I'm signing up for it because of like a future reality that I think is going to be good. So I feel like I'm a little bit of that phase right now.
Well, you're Spartan.
Yeah.
Like you know exactly what to do.
Yep.
Thank you. Well, we really appreciate it. Where can people find out more about Allies Against Slavery? Is there a way for people to learn about you guys?
Yep.
Learn a little bit
Our
more?
website's the best place for that, alliesagainstslavery.org. And reach out there.
Okay, fantastic. Well, thank you so much.
Yeah.
We're looking forward to V2.
I know.
Yeah.
I can't wait.
Thanks, y'all.
So great.
Awesome.
Awesome. Well, thank you guys. And as always, thank you for listening to the As You Are podcast. And please join us on all platforms we're around. Thank you.